Welcome to this video where we're going to focus on inserting questions into the QPSMR companion platform, and it's just going to focus on inserting the questions in some detail without really worrying about things like filters or the flow of the questionnaire in terms of perhaps randomization of the order of the questions are asked. We're just going to focus on that core business of getting the questions into the questionnaire in QPSMR companion. So I'm going to start by going into the Insert menu and clicking Question Entry. You see there's two options here. I could put it before another entry if there was some already there, or by default it'll just add them on the end. So here we go. And the first thing that comes up is a screen where I'm invited to put in a question number. So I'm going to put in question 1 here, and in the drop down to the right of that I choose the question type that I want. And there's a number of question types, so the first two on the list are single response only, so that would only allow one answer regardless of how many answers you want to put in. It would only allow one or none. A multi-response allowed question would mean that you can have any number of responses, none, one or more. An integer question will just allow you to enter a whole number. A floating point will let you enter a number with decimal places. A character text will let you collect a string of text. Usually that's not used for processing, so it might be a name, address, or something like that. Then we have date and time. These aren't usually used in survey questions. These are reserved mainly for CATI questionnaires when you want to set up a callback time for someone. Now, verbatim text is where you want to actually record exactly what someone says, where the interviewer wants to key that in word for word. That data is stored in a separate file, and indeed there's another video that will show you how to code that data, but in this video we'll show you how to enter the actual question that has an open-ended answers to it. And then finally you've got none, where it's just text that an interviewer might read out rather than an actual question where you're collecting something from a respondent. So for the first question I'm going to pick single response, and here you'll immediately see below it width. Now I can leave that for the software to decide for itself. If I want to set that width to 1, I could do, so I could just type a 1 in here and that would set the width to 1, or I could leave it to decide for itself what width it needs. Suffice to say that it must be wide enough for the number of responses. So if I had more than 9 responses here, I'd need to set that width to at least 2 to accommodate responses 10, 11, 12 and so on. So I'm going to go for 1 here, and the question I'm going to ask is, have you visited the channel? So we've got our question for question 1, and in here I will typically click the responses, and I can click on this icon here so that I can just type them in, yes and no, click OK, and that's allowed me to enter that question, and I can close it and the question is saved to the worksheet. Now there's a lot more options that I could have used here when I was setting this question up. We've already seen the drop down here, we've seen the width that I could have set here. At the top here you'll see there's a band of different things that I can enter. The most common ones that you use are settings. You'll see a tick appears when anything has been set within any of these items. So there's a tick on responses now because I've entered 2 responses, yes and no. Let's quickly look at the ones to the left here. So extra, this allows me to put some extra text in before or after the question, or data entry instructions for somebody who's going to key it in. So I can just type into these fields, and that text would be information that someone could read out before they ask the question or after the question, and it's just straight text that you enter there. It's not for such a question. Alright, let's close that. Now filters I'm not covering in this video, that's on a subsequent video, the whole business of setting up filters and applying them to one or more questions. So this would be where you would go to actually put a filter on a question so that only certain people were allowed to answer that particular question. Now let's look at the settings menu. There's quite a lot of different things that we can do here. You can see down here we've got some things that apply to CATI. If you haven't got a CATI license, these would be disabled. So we could set sample points and quotas here, or use particular questions for quotas. We're not going to cover that. All of the ways of working with CATI are covered in a separate series of videos on CATI. This has been grayed out so that you can't use an image on this particular type of question. We'll see that on another type of question in a minute. And you can see here there's some tools for dealing with answers. So we could suspend input of this question, which would be a rather sensitive thing to do because nobody could get beyond the first question. And here we've got randomized responses. So if you wanted to randomize the order of the responses so that yes and no were randomly coming out as yes, no, and no, yes, you could do that. That would be more appropriate probably to a multiple response question. Over here we've got some things grayed out at the moment because they're not appropriate to a single response question. So we can't set minimum maximum values over here because that only applies to numbers. And there's no text being keyed in here, so we're not worried about being able to use upper or lower case or setting it to upper or lower case. But we'll come to that again in a little while. If we want to have verbatims, we can code that back to an entry. Again, that's not appropriate here. But something we have got here is pre-selecting responses. Now, I don't want to do that to this question because there's nothing to pre-select, but we'll look at that in a subsequent question in a minute. And we could put some routing instructions so that when we print the printable version of the questionnaire, we get some instructions here as to where the flow of a paper questionnaire would go to next. Well, as it happens, I don't want any of those options there, so I'm going to click on the Responses tab. And you can see when I click on the Responses tab, down the bottom here, I've got some settings that control input for a response and analysis for a response. So if I click on one of these, I'm clicking on the no answer. For the input here, I've got some options where I can control which people answer these questions. So I could make that single response only. Well, it's already a single response question, so it really doesn't apply here. But on a multi-response question, that might be quite useful if I had a list of brands and then none of these at the bottom. I could fix that at the bottom of the list if it's a randomized list of responses. I could filter this response on a previous question so that only people could give that response if they'd given an answer or not an answer at a previous one or more questions. And I've got other options here to suspend and refuse input and also to put in routing. So similar sort of things, but applying just to the response. And under analysis here, I've got some similar responses so that I could suppress this response if it had to be 0. I could put in some ranking, or I could put a base so that subsequent rows were filtered on people who said no. Again, not very appropriate here. And here's a new page that will get thrown in analysis. So I don't want any of these, but we're going to use some of these things in a minute. So I'm going to save this question, and I'm going to insert now a multi-response question. Question 2, and now we're going to use some of these options. So now you can see it always defaults to multi, so I'm actually going to leave that unchanged. So I'm now going to ask which of the brands have they heard of. So that's got the question in. I'm leaving the width to sort itself out here. Responses. Well, I should just say one thing on that thing there. You can also set here, when you've got a multi-response question, the maximum number of responses you're going to allow. So perhaps if you've got a long make model list of cars that someone might be considering as their next purchase, you might have a list of 500 makes and models of cars, but you might limit them to perhaps 5 or 10 answers rather than being able to choose every single make and model, which would be most unlikely. So you could ask them to choose the 5 most likely models that they would want to consider. Okay, but I'm going to leave that at the default at the moment. Go to the responses, click on this icon, and add my responses. And I'm just going to add in here some brands, and I've got 5 brands here. And at the bottom, I'm going to put none of these. Okay. So I've got my brands, so my list of brands in, and none of these. And here's an example now where I will go into responses, click that response, and for that response I'm going to click a input setting, and I'm going to say single response only here, so that no one can choose one of the brands and none of these, because that really doesn't make sense. And I'm also going to fix its position down the bottom, because what I'm going to do as well here, I'm going to actually randomize these responses. So I'm going to pick the first response, and I want to randomize the responses in this question here. So we can continue from here, and we could now go to perhaps one of the settings for the question. So if we click on settings, one of the options that I might want here is to randomize the responses. So I can click on randomize responses, and when I go into the responses, I would probably choose that none of these isn't randomized, so it stays at the bottom of the list. So on the input tab here, I would select the fixed position so that it stays at the bottom of the list and isn't randomized. So brands A to E would come out on a CAPI questionnaire in a randomized order, whereas none of these would stay at the bottom. So let's save that particular question, question 2, and now let's go on to question 3. And the question 3 might be, which of these brands have you ever bought? And I could have copied this question from the previous question, but we'll look at that at another stage. So let's just put these back in again. So I could have copied and pasted these. We'll look at that shortly. So same list of responses. And what I can do here in the settings, I could say I want to pre-select the responses from question 2. So any brands that they've heard of, I want to pull through to question 3 so that the interviewer knows which ones are possibly appropriate for selecting as brands they've actually used. The option here, auto select responses, means that it's just automatically selected and it goes on. Now the option below that, auto select response, is used less frequently. That means that the answers automatically get put into this question without actually having any input from the interviewer or the person doing data entry. So that would be used perhaps where you're building up answers from different questions, first mention, second mention, third mention, to make a composite question that's not really on the questionnaire, which is all mentions from first, second or third. So we're not going to cover that here, that will be covered separately. Alright, so we've now completed that part of the exercise, so we're going to close that particular question. I've got the maximum there set wrongly, so I'm just going to set that to a maximum of 5 possible answers and save that. Alright, so that's question 3 in the questionnaire now. Now there is another technique for filtering responses when you want to pull them through from a previous question like I did there. So we could have at question 4 actually applied a filter so that we only restricted the possible answers at question 3 to those that were selected in question 2, and that's a rather different technique which we'll be covering under filters in the filters video. Alright, so now we're going to move on to question 4, and this time we're going to choose an integer, and we're going to set this to 2 digits, and we're going to ask the number of times shop in a month. So this is going to be just collecting the number of times. I've set it to a width of 2 here on the assumption that nobody would choose more than 99, but I think it's just pretty unlikely. So we're going to move on to that, and then we're going to go into settings, and you can see some different things are now available to be keyed in. So we might, for example, here say, well, actually, nobody in our sample would be outside the range of 0 to, shall we say, 30. So 30 shopping trips in a month is probably the maximum. And you can see that these boxes are also enabled, and that's where perhaps on a particularly a paper questionnaire where you might allow 99 if it's been pre-coded as 99 for people who don't know. So that would mean it allows any answer between 0 and 30 or 99, but if they entered 50 shopping trips in a month, a message would come up rejecting that because it's outside the range that we're permitting on data entry. So that's just been allowed and was greyed out before, but now it's been enabled so that for an integer you can enter that information, and we can save that, and you can see that that has been set to 2 digits, and it's documented at the end here the possible values that you can have. So that's an integer question entered there. All right, let's move on down the list to question 5. Now, a floating point question works in the same way as an integer, except there you're allowing decimal places, so we're not going to illustrate that, but if you do set the width, when you set the width for that, you will want to allow for the decimal point. So if the maximum number was 100.0, for example, you'd have to allow a width of 5 for that. All right, let's move on to a character question now. Again, here you'll set the width. Let's say we're going to allow 100 characters. Please supply your email address. And you could put some instructions in here if you wanted to, something we haven't done before. Prompt respondent for most frequently used email address, and you can use some color coding system here so that different colors mean different things, perhaps to different people or as different types of instructions. That can be an internal decision of your own. I've set the width here to 100 characters, and that's just going to record it as character text, and that saves that information. All right, we now move on to question 6, and this time we're going to choose a verbatim question. So this will record exactly what someone says or has entered on a paper questionnaire, so it can be typed in. The results from a verbatim question end up in a spreadsheet, a CSV file, so that if you wish to, you can either just manipulate them in a spreadsheet or you can actually code them and back code that information back onto the main data set so that you can use it in analysis. So what is your opinion of brand A, or brand X shall we say? And if we go into settings and responses here, you can see we've got some things here, like anything that's typed in, we could upcase this. So this wasn't available before, we could automatically uppercase it. We might want to code this data to a particular entry. If we did, we would put in we would highlight this here and choose the entry we're going to code it to. But I'm not going to choose either of these on this occasion, but they're just good ways of setting text in some more uniform way. There's nothing here in the responses because there are no responses. There are, but the responses will just go straight off to the CSV file. So there's nothing to set here. We can just close this, and question 6 is saved as a verbatim question. And the final one on the list here is question 7. We're going to pick a none here, and here we're going to say, please show this advert to respondent. And the reason I've chosen that is in the settings here, I can choose a picture or a video that I want to show the respondent, and I can just search for that. So I think I've got an image here, and there's a picture of an advert in here which could be displayed to a respondent so that they could then ask a question subsequently to that said something like, so that's just to show to a respondent. We could have 7A, and in here we could say, do you recall seeing this advert? And in the responses we could just say yes, no, and that would be a separate question that we're asking here. Alright, so that's gone through all the different types of question that you can enter, and we've covered most of the options once you get inside a question here. Just to recap on some of those, I'm going to put a question in very quickly. So we've looked at putting in the question text here, setting the width and the maximum responses. We've seen the different question types here. We've looked at the instructions you can put in. You've got some extra things here for putting in extra text for your questionnaire. We're covering filters on a separate video about filters. Settings, we've looked at most of the things on here. And in responses, as you can see, when you enter your responses, you can add a response, and then with that response you can go to the input settings and set some restrictions on the input or rules for the input, and on analysis you've got some options here to apply ranking and so on. Now the only other type of question that's worth having a look at is a single response question, so I'm going to just quit this question here and not save it, so that wasn't saved here. Sorry, it was saved and we need to cut because I've been wrong. Okay. And finally here we're going to put in a rating scale which perhaps has a grid of questions or a block of questions with the same responses. So we start by putting the first one in just in the normal way as a single entry. Now this is different from QPSMR Insight if you're familiar with that. So I'm going to put in Q8A, and it's important to give it a sensible suffix or last character, and you'll see why in a second. So let's set that single, set the width to 1, and how do you rate brand A? I'm going to go into responses, add the responses, that's very good, 5, quite good, 4, okay is 3, quite poor is 2, and very poor as 1. I'm going to check the box here for values at the end of lines, so it'll treat those numbers on the end as scores. So let's click OK to that. And now if I want to just replicate that for the next question or the next item in my rating scale, I can just go duplicate this entry. It'll automatically make it B, Q8B. I can then just change that to B. Everything else is held here. The scores you can see that we put in just now are held over. And I can just do another one, 8C. And how do I rate brand C? And indeed, if there's a filter applying to each of those differently, for those who have heard of A, B and C, they're also covered as well, or carried through for you automatically as well. So the logic is followed for any filters that you use. So as I say, filters are covered separately. So we can just carry on adding things here by duplicating this 8D and doing brand D and so on. And then when we finish that, we can close it, and you can see it's set up 4 entries for me here for brands A, B, D and C, A, B, C and D, so that's all ready to use in the questionnaire. And then the final step you're going to go to now is to, having done this, you're probably going to save this work. We'll give it a name as QPSMR data 1. So that's saving. So the final step now is to save this, and we'll do a very quick test that it looks okay in data entry. So you can see there's a red square around the save button, which means it needs to be saved. So I'm going to quickly save it. And now if we just want to see that, what it looks like in data entry, we can go into answers, test input for a paper questionnaire. So click OK. And we can see what our questionnaire looks like for data entry. We can add a test record. We can select the first answer as yes. These, we can choose these answers. You see, if we pick none of these, it comes up with an error, so that's working correctly. On to the next screen. Let's pull through the answers that we asked for from question 2, so I can either check those or uncheck those as appropriate. Number of times shop in a month, 10. If I'd have put in 100 there, it would have stopped me doing that because I think we set the limit at 30. Email address, my name at myname.com. What's your opinion of brand X? It is excellent. And do you recall seeing the advert? No, remember they saw a video or a picture, I think it was. And we're going through now the final questions here, and that completes the input. Now we'll be covering input and testing your input and actually doing data entry in more detail in a subsequent video. But that's taking you through the basic principles of entering your questionnaire. We're going to look in a separate video about editing your questionnaire and putting some more controls in there and looking at filters. But that completes this video on inserting questions into your QPSMR companion software.